This video was made possible by Dashlane. Browse the internet faster and easier by signing up for free at dashlane.com/Wendover. On November 3rd, 2020, hundreds of millions of Americans will all make their way to their local polling stations to cast their votes, deciding who will be the next president of the United States of America. That day will be the accumulation of a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar election process, but before that all truly ends, the votes need to be counted and the winner has to be declared. As soon as the first polls close at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, there begins a massive overnight exercise to count hundreds of millions of votes and, typically, declare who will next lead the country by the early hours of the following morning. While the true effort doesn't start until the early evening of voting day, the first results come in the early morning of election day before most polls have even opened. A few small towns on the East Coast, most famously Dixville Notch, New Hampshire, all compete to be the first precinct in the US to report results. New Hampshire state law allows polling places in the state to close early as long as all registered voters have cast their ballots. Given that the town only has a dozen or so registered voters, this process is typically finished in minutes or seconds. In front of a cluster of cameras from nearly every major news organization, the votes are read out and tallied. The process of counting a dozen or so paper ballots in a small town is not tough, but a few hours later, the rest of the country's polling places will open, each of which eventually has to accurately count up to thousands of votes. What makes the US election so difficult to conduct right is that there are over 178,000 individual voting precincts, each of which can and does do things in a slightly different way. Some use paper ballots that have to be read and interpreted manually, some use paper ballots that are scanned by a machine, some use electronic voting machines, and some even allow for absentee voting over the internet. The selection of a voting method is a difficult balancing act. Handwritten paper ballots are simple and cheap, which means that a polling station can process loads of voters at once, but they're much more difficult to count. Electronic voting machines are expensive and complicated, meaning they're often in short supply, leading to longer lines, but counting and reporting the votes happen almost instantaneously. Also a major concern in the selection of voting method is security. The most secure ballot is no doubt a handwritten paper one, as submitting a fraudulent vote involves physically acquiring and submitting a ballot, something that can't be easily done at a large scale. Arguably, the least secure method is electronic voting machines, as anything electronic can be hacked. Almost every voting machine out there has been hacked in some way or another in controlled experiments at hacker conventions such as DEF CON. In the real world, it's impossible to know for sure how often voting security has been compromised, but we do know that these machines can be hacked, which is why still today much of the US votes the same way it did hundreds of years ago, on paper ballots. First to close their polling places will be parts of Indiana and Kentucky at 6 p.m. Eastern. The second that happens, everything shifts into counting mode. Both states use a mix of optical scan and direct record electronic voting machines. For example, the majority of Kentucky's machines are Hart Intercivic e-scans. These are those optical scan electronic machines where a voter physically fills out a paper ballot, shading in bubbles for their preferred candidates, then feeds the sheet into a machine which scans their responses and then records and tallies the votes. In Indiana, however, the majority of their machines are Microvote Infinities, which are examples of direct record electronic machines. These are fully electronic machines where the voter selects their candidates of choice on the screen before pressing a button to cast their votes. Once 6 p.m. rolls around though, the machines' voting modes will be turned off, they will print out a physical paper backup displaying the tally of votes for each candidate, and the poll workers will remove a sort of memory device that stores the totals. Every step of this process has to be witnessed by multiple people, usually of different political parties. These papers and memory devices are all then packed up in sealed envelopes and gathered together. From there, the votes need to make it to a central vote counting location. Usually, they're driven there by the county's police to assure there is no interference. That works in most places, but not all. For example, anyone who's been in Los Angeles in the early evening, when their polls close, knows that it would take hours to get a vehicle from Gorman, on the northern end of Los Angeles County, to Norwalk, where votes are tallied. Therefore, the county uses helicopters to fly voting records to Norwalk from across the county, and therefore ends up spending many millions of dollars on each election day. Traffic is less of a concern in Indiana and Kentucky though, and so, not long after 6 p.m. Eastern, votes will start arriving at their central counting locations where all the memory devices will be plugged in to a tabulating computer that will record the results. They'll also add in the results from early and absentee voting as well. Given the electronic nature of this count, when votes have physically arrived at the site, the process doesn't take long, but throughout it all, it will be observed by a bipartisan grouping of poll workers and officials. Of course, the way the world hears about the results of the election is not via the government itself, but rather through the media. Almost always, the media tells the public who will win the election before all the votes have come in, and they make this call based off two key pieces of information. The first is election day polling. There are two competing systems of polling. The first is the Associated Press's VoteCast system, a relatively new method where voters are polled at home via the internet and phone in the days leading up to Election Day, and the second is the National Election Pool system used by ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC. This system uses the more traditional exit poll method, where individuals leaving polling stations are asked who they voted for in an attempt to gather a representative sample. Both of these systems give media organizations an idea of how voters are leaning on Election Day and help them know where the results are likely to swing. The second major data point used to project election results are the results themselves. A small sampling of results from a county should be roughly representative of the county's results overall. The Associated Press stations about 4,000 of its reporters in vote counting centers all across the country, and as soon as these counties report results, the reporters call them in to the AP's office in Spokane, Washington. There, one of hundreds of data entry personnel will answer the phone and put the information into the AP system. These data, which may at the time of entry be unofficial, are used by news organizations all around the world. Throughout the night, results will come in precinct by precinct, and the AP will call the results precinct by precinct. The last polls close at 1 a.m. Eastern Time in Alaska. However, more than likely, the country will already know who has won the election by that time. The AP's DC Bureau is in charge of calling the race. They'll one by one declare each state won for one candidate or the other. Some states they'll know from the second polls close which way they'll go. For example, in 2016, the highly Democratic states of Massachusetts, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, along with the District of Columbia, were all called for Clinton by the AP the very minute polls closed in those places at 8 p.m. Eastern. The AP just knew off of historical voting trends and exit polling that they would certainly go blue. Meanwhile, battleground states, with a fairly even mix of Democrats and Republicans, tend to be trickier to call and require a good proportion of actual results to come in. For example, Minnesota's results in 2016 weren't called until 11:09 a.m. Eastern, and Alaska's not until 11:58 a.m. Eastern on the day after the election. Far before the last state is called, though, the combination of electoral votes designated to the called states will exceed the required majority, 270, and at that time, the AP will send out what they call a flash. These are the very highest tier of AP alerts, reserved for, as they describe it, events they expect to be one of the very top stories of the year. The AP averages less than 2 flashes a year, and such an alert has been used for events like the killing of Osama bin Laden, the resignation of Pope Benedict, and the death of Nelson Mandela. It is not always the AP who is first to call the race, but more often than not, they are the first major news organization to declare a winner. Historically, this tends to happen between 9 and 11 p.m. Eastern, but sometimes much later and sometimes much earlier. From there, tradition kicks in and the loser calls the winner throws a party, and the next day the sitting president calls the president-elect. The true official results might not come in for days or weeks as states work to tally every vote, not reliant on probability. The moment that happens, though, the clocks reset, and the US and world again begins the 4-year process leading up to the election of the next American president. When evaluating products I might use, like everyone, I'm always looking for a vote of confidence, and for Dashlane, there are 11 million users, their top rating on the App Store, and their endorsement by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and more tells me that it's a product worth using. What everyone sees in Dashlane, myself included, is that it's a simple way to make browsing the internet faster, safer, and more efficient. Dashlane securely stores things like passwords, addresses, frequent flyer numbers, passport numbers, and plenty more, and then autofills them when they're needed so that everything happens faster. It syncs all this information across devices, no matter if it's Mac, PC, iOS, or Android, so it's always there when you need it. You can make your internet experience faster for free for 31 days by going to dashlane.com/Wendover. After that, by using the code Wendover, you'll get 10% off upgrading to Dashlane Premium.